The church bells rang insistently, announcing what was meant to be the beginning of a dream. The red carpet stretched along the main aisle, and white flowers intertwined with golden ribbons filled the air with a soft fragrance. Claire was stunning. Her lace dress seemed like a whisper of purity, with a veil that resembled an ethereal cloud resting on her carefully styled hair. Every step she took echoed through the church walls, which were packed with guests eager to witness the moment Claire and Alexander would unite forever. From the altar, Alexander, the groom, couldn't take his eyes off her. He was visibly emotional. With his heart racing, he clutched tightly to the small crucifix his sister Camille had given him years ago, a talisman of protection he'd carried since her disappearance. Despite the pain of never finding answers about Camille, Alexander allowed himself to hope for a future alongside Claire on this day. As Claire walked down the aisle, the murmurs of the congregation faded into a reverent silence. Her eyes met Alexander's, and in that moment, the world seemed to stop. But just as she was about to take another step, a child's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Mommy!" A little girl with dark hair and deeply expressive eyes ran toward Claire. Her shoes clattered noisily on the church floor, shattering the solemn atmosphere. She wore a simple, worn dress, as if she had come from a far-off place. The girl clung to Claire's gown, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and desperation. The shock was immediate. Indignant murmurs spread through the church. All eyes turned to Claire, who stood frozen, as if struck by lightning. Alexander stepped forward, his face a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Claire, what's going on? Who is this child?" Claire opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. The little girl clung tightly to her dress and repeated the word that had plunged the church into chaos. "Mommy." In the front pew, Madame Therese, Alexander's mother, suddenly stood up. Her eyes were fixed on Claire with a look that was equal parts disgust and triumph. She had never approved of the relationship between her son and Claire, always seeing the young woman as an outsider unworthy of joining their family. "I knew this woman was hiding something. I always knew. Alexander, this is a betrayal of your trust." The groom was stunned. He looked at Claire, expecting an explanation, but she remained silent, as if the weight of the moment had suffocated her. The little girl held onto her dress even tighter, as if afraid Claire might vanish. The priest tried to intervene, his voice trembling as he called for calm among the guests, but the atmosphere had already turned into a storm of murmurs and accusations. Finally, Alexander broke the silence that seemed to have paralyzed Claire. "Claire, who is this girl? Why does she call you mother?" His words came out more as a plea than an accusation. Alexander's love for Claire was evident, but doubt was eating away at him. Claire looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears, but before she could answer, the tension became unbearable. She dropped the bouquet she had been holding, took the girl's hand, and ran out of the church, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. As the guests tried to process what they had just witnessed, Alexander remained standing at the altar, as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. In that moment, he knew his wedding had turned into a puzzle that demanded answers he might not be ready to hear. The small inn where Claire had taken refuge was dark and quiet. The curtains were drawn, and the faint sound of rain tapping against the window added to the oppressive stillness of the room. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she tried to untangle her thoughts. The little girl, Antonietta, sat beside her, clutching a small locket to her chest like a precious treasure. Antonietta's innocent voice broke the silence. "Mommy, are we safe now?" Claire's heart ached at the word "mommy." She knelt in front of the child, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. Antonietta's eyes were wide, filled with trust and fear. "Yes, sweetie, we're safe," Claire said, forcing her voice to sound calm even though her mind was a whirlwind of fear and memories. Antonietta opened the locket and showed it to Claire. Inside was a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. It was Camille, Alexander's younger sister. Seeing her face again sent a wave of anguish crashing over Claire. She remembered every moment that had led to this day, every choice she had made to protect this little girl. 5 years earlier, Claire had met Camille in a small, dimly lit clinic on the outskirts of the city. Camille had been desperate, her hands shaking as she explained that she was fleeing from an abusive man who had vowed to destroy her and take her child. Camille's fear was palpable, her voice trembling with urgency as she begged Claire for help. "I can't keep her safe anymore," Camille had said, tears streaming down her face as she held baby Antonietta. "Please, Claire. You're the only one I trust." Back then, Claire had been working as a volunteer at the clinic, providing care for women in dire situations. She had tried to convince Camille to go to the authorities, but Camille had refused. "They won't believe me," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before disappearing, Camille had placed Antonietta in Claire's arms and handed her the locket. "This is all I can give her. Keep her safe. Promise me." Then she was gone. Claire had spent years honoring that promise. She had hidden Antonietta from the world, raising her as her own daughter. But as she stared at the photograph in the locket, she felt the crushing weight of the secret she had kept from Alexander. He had spent years searching for answers about Camille's disappearance, and she had stayed silent, knowing the truth would shatter him. Now, it was too late to hide. Antonietta had innocently brought the truth into the light, and Claire had no idea how to face the storm that was coming. In the dim light of the room, Antonietta looked up at Claire, her small hand resting on Claire's knee. "Mommy, will Alexander be mad at us?" Claire froze. She didn't know how to explain to a child the complexities of adult betrayal and love. Instead, she kissed Antonietta's forehead and held her close. "Don't worry about that, my love. I'll take care of everything." But in her heart, Claire knew that everything she had fought so hard to protect was on the verge of crumbling. The streets were dark and narrow, illuminated only by the flickering light of an occasional street lamp. Claire clutched Antonietta's hand tightly, her heart pounding as they made their way through the maze of alleys in the outskirts of the city. Every sound, a distant car engine, a cat knocking over a trash can, made her jump. She felt as if the shadows themselves were watching her, closing in. Antonietta struggled to keep up, her small legs unable to match Claire's hurried pace. "Mommy, where are we going?" the girl asked, her voice a soft whimper. Claire stopped briefly, kneeling down to meet Antonietta's eyes. She cupped the child's face with her trembling hands, forcing herself to sound calm despite the fear boiling inside her. "We're going somewhere safe, sweetheart. Somewhere no one can hurt us." Antonietta nodded, her trust in Claire unwavering, and they continued on their way. Earlier that evening, Claire had overheard two men in the hallway of the inn. Their voices were low, but the mention of a woman with a child had made her blood run cold. She didn't wait to find out if they were talking about her. Instinct had taken over, and she grabbed Antonietta and fled, leaving behind all of their belongings. The streets seemed endless, but Claire finally spotted a cluster of dilapidated buildings in the distance. It was a neighborhood she remembered from years ago, a place where she had once helped a kind woman named Rosa. Rosa had a small sewing shop there, and Claire prayed she was still around. They reached the neighborhood, and Claire knocked on the door of the shop, her breath coming in short gasps. The sign above the door was faded, but it still read, "Rosa's Repairs." For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the door creaked open, and an older woman with kind eyes peered out cautiously. "Claire." Rosa's voice was filled with both surprise and concern. She quickly ushered them inside, locking the door behind them. "What are you doing here at this hour? And who is this little one?" Claire didn't have the strength to explain everything. Instead, she collapsed onto a worn chair, holding Antonietta close. "Rosa, I need your help. We have nowhere else to go," she said, her voice cracking. Rosa didn't ask any more questions. She placed a comforting hand on Claire's shoulder and nodded. "You're safe here. I'll take care of you both." The small sewing shop became their refuge. Rosa pulled out a spare mattress from the back room and laid it on the floor for Claire and Antonietta. As the child fell asleep, exhausted from the night's ordeal, Claire sat at the edge of the mattress, her mind racing. She knew this was only the beginning. Whoever those men were, they would keep searching. And if they found her, they would find Antonietta. The thought made her stomach churn. Rosa sat beside her, a warm cup of tea in her hands. "Claire, I don't know what's going on, but I can see it's serious," Rosa said gently. "You're not alone. We'll figure this out together." Claire looked at her old friend, tears welling up in her eyes. The kindness in Rosa's voice was a lifeline in the chaos that had consumed her life. "Thank you, Rosa. I don't know what I would do without you." For the first time in hours, Claire felt a sliver of hope. Rosa's shop wasn't much, but it was a start. A place to breathe, to think, to plan her next move. But as she glanced at the sleeping Antonietta, she knew one thing for certain: running was not a solution. Sooner or later, the past would catch up with them, and she would need to face it head-on. In the stillness of the night, Claire made a silent vow. She would protect Antonietta at all costs, even if it meant confronting the secrets and dangers she had tried so hard to bury. The neighborhood was alive with the sounds of morning. Vendors shouted about fresh bread and fruits, children laughed as they chased each other through narrow alleys, and the hum of conversations carried through the air like a comforting melody. It was a world apart from the polished streets Claire had left behind. Rosa's sewing shop was small and cluttered, but it felt like a sanctuary. Bolts of fabric lined the shelves, and a sewing machine hummed softly in the background as Rosa worked on repairing an old dress. Antonietta sat at a table in the corner, sketching on scraps of paper with a pencil Rosa had given her. Claire sat by the window, staring out at the bustling street. Her mind churned with worry, but the warmth of the community began to seep into her guarded heart. Despite the weariness in their lives, the people here moved with a sense of purpose and resilience that Claire couldn't help but admire. Rosa noticed Claire's distant expression and set her work aside. She brought over 2 cups of steaming tea, placing one in front of Claire. "You've been through a lot, querida. But you're safe now," Rosa said, her voice firm yet kind. "These people, they take care of their own. You'll see." As if on cue, a knock came at the door. Rosa opened it to reveal a middle-aged woman holding a small basket. Her name was Dolores, and she was a baker who lived 2 doors down. "I heard there's a new family staying with you," Dolores said with a warm smile, handing the basket to Rosa. "I brought some bread for them. And if you ever need anything, Claire, just ask." Claire was taken aback by the gesture. In the world she had come from, kindness like this was rare. "Thank you," she said, her voice almost breaking. Over the next few days, Claire began to experience the quiet strength of the community. When the news spread that a young mother and her child were in need, the residents rallied around them. A carpenter named Eduardo fixed the broken lock on Rosa's front door to make the shop more secure. A retired teacher named Marta brought books and toys for Antonietta, who quickly became a favorite among the neighborhood children. The women who worked in Rosa's sewing shop were particularly supportive. They invited Claire to join them, teaching her how to use the sewing machine and joking that everyone in the neighborhood eventually became a seamstress. Though Claire's stitches were uneven and clumsy at first, the women encouraged her with laughter and patience. For the first time in weeks, Claire felt a glimmer of normalcy. She even began to smile again as she watched Antonietta play with the other children in the small courtyard outside the shop. But beneath the surface, Claire's anxiety never fully disappeared. Late at night, when the neighborhood grew quiet, she would lie awake, listening for unfamiliar footsteps or whispered voices. The image of the men from the inn haunted her, their faces vague but their threat unmistakable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the streets were bathed in golden light, Rosa sat beside Claire on the shop's front step. "This place, it has its dangers," Rosa said, her tone serious. "But the people here, they protect each other. No one will let harm come to you or Antonietta." Claire nodded, her heart heavy. "I'm so grateful for everything, Rosa," she said. "But I can't help feeling like it's only a matter of time before they find us." Rosa placed a comforting hand on Claire's shoulder. "Then we'll face it together," she said. "You're not alone anymore." As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Claire watched the children playing in the courtyard, their laughter filling the air. The community had embraced her and Antonietta, offering a lifeline when they had nowhere else to turn. But deep down, Claire knew this fragile peace couldn't last forever. The shadows of her past were still out there, and the men who had hunted her weren't the type to give up easily. The question wasn't if they would come, but when. The peaceful rhythm of the neighborhood was shattered one afternoon when Claire noticed two unfamiliar figures lingering at the edge of the courtyard. The men stood near a fruit vendor, their gazes darting around as if searching for something, or someone. One of them, a tall man with sharp features, whispered something to his companion, who nodded and began scanning the area. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She knew those faces. They were the same men she had overheard at the inn, the ones asking questions about her and Antonietta. Trying to remain calm, she turned back toward the sewing shop, where Rosa and the others were busy working. Antonietta was sitting on a small stool, chatting happily with one of the women, unaware of the growing tension. Claire forced herself to walk instead of run. She slipped into the shop, closing the door softly but firmly behind her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she moved toward Rosa. "We have a problem," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Rosa looked up, concern flashing across her face. "What is it?" "There are two men outside. I've seen them before, they've been looking for us," Claire said, glancing toward the window. Rosa immediately sprang into action. She gestured to the other women in the shop, who quickly understood the gravity of the situation. Without a word, they began closing the blinds and locking the doors. The friendly, bustling shop transformed into a fortress. "Stay calm," Rosa said, placing a reassuring hand on Claire's arm. "We'll handle this." Antonietta noticed the sudden change in atmosphere and ran to Claire's side. "Mommy, what's happening?" she asked, her wide eyes filled with worry. Claire knelt down, pulling the child into a tight embrace. "Nothing, sweetheart. Stay close to me, okay?" From the window, Rosa peeked out carefully, observing the two men. "They're definitely looking for someone," she said. "But they don't seem to know where to go yet." Eduardo, the carpenter who had been repairing a nearby fence, appeared in the shop doorway. Rosa quickly filled him in, and his expression darkened. "We need to get them out of here," Eduardo said. "If they see the child, they'll know they've found what they're looking for." The community acted with quiet precision. Eduardo and a few other men from the neighborhood approached the strangers under the guise of offering help. Their friendly demeanor masked the underlying tension as they asked the men what they were looking for. "We're just passing through," one of the strangers lied, his sharp eyes scanning the area behind Eduardo. The carpenter stood his ground, subtly blocking the man's view of the shop. "Well, you won't find much here but good people and hard-working families," Eduardo said firmly. "Maybe you should try the next neighborhood over." The men hesitated, their suspicion evident. But the gathering crowd of locals, all wearing guarded expressions, seemed to make them reconsider. After exchanging a few quiet words, the strangers walked away, though their lingering glances hinted they weren't giving up so easily. Inside the shop, Claire watched the scene unfold through a small crack in the blinds. Relief washed over her as the men disappeared down the street, but it was short-lived. She knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Eduardo returned to the shop, his face grim. "They're gone for now, but they'll be back," he said. "You need to be ready, Claire." Claire nodded, her resolve hardening. "I can't keep running forever," she said. "If they find us again, I need to know why they're after us and what they want." Rosa crossed her arms, her expression stern. Then we'll be ready. This isn't just your fight anymore, Claire. You have people who care about you here. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Claire sat with Antonietta, holding her close. The child's quiet breathing was a source of comfort, but the weight of the danger they faced pressed heavily on Claire's mind. For the first time, she realized that protecting Antonietta might mean confronting the very men she had been running from. If she didn't, their fragile sanctuary would never truly be safe. The people of the neighborhood had proven they were willing to stand by her, but Claire knew the battle ahead was one she couldn't avoid much longer. The following morning, the air was heavy with tension, but the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm, as if to shield Claire and Antonietta with an illusion of normalcy. Claire tried to focus on the hum of sewing machines and Rosa's gentle encouragement, but her thoughts were elsewhere. As the day wore on, Claire couldn't shake the nagging sense that her time in the neighborhood was running out. Antonietta was playing quietly in the back room when Rosa came to her side with a hesitant expression. "Someone's asking for you," Rosa said softly, her tone laced with caution. Claire's heart dropped. "Who is it?" Rosa hesitated before answering. "A man. Well-dressed. He said his name is Alexander." The name struck Claire like lightning. She felt the room tilt slightly, her breath catching in her throat. Alexander. She had spent days agonizing over what he must think of her after the scene in the church, but she hadn't dared to imagine he would find her here. "Where is he?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Rosa gestured toward the small courtyard in front of the shop. "He's waiting. He looks upset, but not angry. Just confused." Claire swallowed hard, steeling herself. She glanced at Antonietta, who was still blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. "Stay with her," Claire said to Rosa. "I'll handle this." She stepped outside, the afternoon sun blinding her momentarily. When her vision cleared, she saw Alexander standing near the fountain in the center of the courtyard. He was wearing a dark suit, slightly wrinkled from travel, and his expression was a mixture of exhaustion and determination. His eyes locked onto hers the moment she appeared, and for a few seconds, neither of them moved. The tension between them was palpable, an unspoken battle of emotions playing out in the space between them. "Claire," Alexander said finally, his voice heavy with restrained emotion. She approached cautiously, keeping her arms crossed as if to shield herself from whatever was about to happen. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Alexander's jaw tightened. "It wasn't easy. I followed leads, asked questions. And then I heard about a woman with a child staying here. I had to see for myself." Claire lowered her gaze, guilt washing over her. "You shouldn't have come," she said. "I had to," Alexander said firmly. "You left me standing at the altar, Claire. You ran, and you took her. And now I understand why." Claire's head snapped up, her eyes widening. "What do you mean?" Alexander hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Antonietta," he said. "She's Camille's daughter, isn't she?" The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Claire's silence was answer enough. Alexander's expression softened, the anger and confusion giving way to something else, pain. "I knew it the moment I saw her," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "She has Camille's eyes." Claire felt tears welling up but blinked them away. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said, her voice trembling. "Camille trusted me to protect her. She was running from something terrible, Alexander. She begged me to keep Antonietta safe, and I promised her I would." "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Do you have any idea how much I've been searching for answers about Camille? I could have helped you." "I was scared," Claire admitted. "I didn't know who I could trust. And then you and I didn't want to lose you." For a moment, Alexander said nothing. He looked away, running a hand through his hair, as if trying to process the flood of emotions. Finally, he turned back to her. "Claire, I'm not here to accuse you. I just want the truth. I need to know what happened to Camille." Claire hesitated, then nodded. "I don't have all the answers," she said. "But I know she was running from two men. Dangerous men. They were looking for her, and she was terrified of what they'd do if they found her. That's why she disappeared." Alexander's expression darkened. "Do you think they're the same men who are after you now?" Claire nodded again, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sure of it." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the neighborhood. Finally, Alexander stepped closer, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Claire, I don't care about the past. I don't care about the mistakes or the secrets. Right now, we need to protect Antonietta and find out what happened to Camille. Whatever it takes, we'll do it together." Claire's heart ached at the sincerity in his voice. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a sliver of hope. She nodded, her tears finally spilling over. "Thank you," she whispered. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Alexander placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The fragile truce between Claire and Alexander was a balm for her weary soul, but the danger loomed closer with every passing hour. That night, the air felt heavy, and the bustling sounds of the neighborhood faded earlier than usual, leaving an eerie stillness. Claire sat by the window of Rosa's sewing shop, watching the flickering streetlights outside. Alexander had insisted on staying nearby, renting a room from Eduardo under the pretense of being a visiting family friend. Antonietta had fallen asleep in Rosa's back room, her small body curled up under a patchwork quilt. Alexander entered the shop quietly, careful not to wake anyone. His face was serious, his posture tense. "We need to talk," he said in a low voice, pulling up a chair beside her. Claire turned to him, her heart sinking. "What is it?" "I've been asking around," Alexander began, his voice measured. "Some of the locals have seen those men, Ernest and Michel. They've been asking questions, just like before. They know you're here, Claire. It's only a matter of time before they come knocking." Claire's breath hitched. She had known this moment would come, but hearing it aloud made the threat feel suffocatingly real. "What do they want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander shook his head. "I don't know yet, but it's clear they were involved in whatever happened to Camille. If we can figure out their endgame, we might find out where she is, or what they did to her." Claire closed her eyes, guilt and fear warring within her. "I promised Camille I'd protect Antonietta. I've tried so hard, but I don't know how much longer I can do this, Alexander." He reached out, placing a hand on hers. His touch was steady, grounding. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said firmly. "We'll figure it out together. But first, we need to keep Antonietta safe." As they spoke, a knock at the door shattered the quiet. The sound was sharp and deliberate, echoing through the shop like a warning. Claire froze, her blood running cold. Rosa appeared from the back, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at the door. "Stay here," Rosa whispered, grabbing a long sewing needle from the table like a weapon. But Alexander stopped her. "I'll handle it." He approached the door cautiously, peeking through the crack in the blinds. His jaw tightened. Outside, Ernest and Michel stood under the dim glow of a street lamp, their shadows stretching ominously across the pavement. "It's them," Alexander said, his voice low and urgent. Claire felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. "What do we do?" Alexander turned to Rosa. "Do you have a back exit?" Rosa nodded. "Through the storage room. Take Antonietta and go," Alexander instructed Claire. "I'll distract them." "No," Claire said, shaking her head. "I can't leave you alone with them. You don't have a choice, Alexander said firmly. If they see you or Antonietta, it's over. Go. Now. Reluctantly, Claire nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She hurried to the back room, where Rosa was already gathering Antonietta in her arms. The little girl stirred, groggy and confused, but Rosa soothed her with whispered reassurances. As Claire helped Rosa guide Antonietta through the storage room and out the back door, Alexander opened the front door of the shop. Can I help you? Alexander asked, his tone cool and composed. Ernest stepped forward, his sharp features twisting into a mockery of politeness. We're looking for someone. A woman and her child. We've heard they might be staying in this neighborhood. Alexander crossed his arms, leaning casually against the doorframe. This is a quiet neighborhood. Maybe you should try your luck elsewhere. Michel, the shorter and more brutish of the two, took a threatening step forward. We don't have time for games, friend. If you know something, you'd better talk. Alexander didn't flinch, his calm demeanor hiding the storm of rage building inside him. I told you, there's no one like that here. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Before the men could respond, Eduardo appeared at the edge of the street, followed by two other neighbors. Their presence was subtle but deliberate, a silent show of strength. Is everything all right, Alexander? Eduardo called, his voice casual but firm. Ernest's sharp gaze shifted between Alexander and the growing group of locals. He muttered something to Michel, and the two men stepped back. We'll be back, Ernest said with a cold smile. As they disappeared into the shadows, Alexander exhaled deeply, the tension in his body finally easing. He closed the door and locked it, turning to Rosa, who had just returned from escorting Claire and Antonietta to a safer location. They're not going to stop, Alexander said grimly. But we bought ourselves some time. Rosa nodded, her expression resolute. We'll be ready next time. Meanwhile, Claire and Antonietta hid in a small, candlelit room in one of the neighboring houses, the weight of their situation pressing heavily on her. Claire held Antonietta close, her resolve hardening with every passing moment. If the men returned, and Claire knew they would, she wouldn't run anymore. It was time to uncover the truth about Camille, confront Ernest and Michel, and protect her daughter, no matter the cost. The morning after Ernest and Michel's visit dawned overcast, with gray clouds hanging low in the sky. The oppressive weather mirrored Claire's mood as she sat with Alexander at a small wooden table in Rosa's kitchen. Antonietta was safely playing with other children under Rosa's watchful eye in the courtyard, giving them a rare moment to talk openly. Alexander placed a thick, worn notebook on the table between them. The edges were frayed, and the leather cover was stained with age. I found this in Camille's room at my mother's house years ago, Alexander said. It didn't make much sense to me at the time, but after seeing those men last night, I think there's more to it than I realized. Claire hesitated before opening the notebook. Inside, the pages were filled with Camille's delicate handwriting, interspersed with hasty sketches and clipped notes. It was a chaotic tapestry of her thoughts, fears, and plans. She was documenting something, Claire murmured, flipping through the pages. This isn't just a diary. Look at these names, these addresses. What was she involved in? Alexander leaned closer, pointing to a specific entry. She mentions Ernest and Michel here, he said, his voice heavy. She calls them, the wolves. She says she's afraid they'll find her. And here, look at this. He slid the notebook closer to her, tapping on a sketch of a warehouse. Beneath it were the words, where it all began. What does this mean? Claire asked, her heart pounding. I don't know, Alexander admitted. But I think that warehouse is the key to everything. If we can find it, we might figure out why Ernest and Michel are so determined to find Antonietta, and what really happened to Camille. Claire felt a surge of determination. For so long, she had been running, hiding, and reacting. Now, for the first time, she had a chance to act. "We need to find this place," she said. Alexander nodded. "I've already started asking around. Eduardo thinks he knows where this could be. It's in an old industrial area, a few miles from here. Abandoned warehouses, no security, it matches Camille's description." But even as they formed a plan, the weight of the decision pressed down on Claire. "If we go there, we might be walking into a trap," she said. "Ernest and Michelle could be waiting." "I've thought about that," Alexander said. "We'll bring backup. Eduardo and a few others from the neighborhood have agreed to help. They don't want these men threatening their community any more than we do." Claire hesitated, the familiar fear clawing at her resolve. But when she thought about Antonietta, her bright smile, her innocent laughter, her hesitation turned into resolve. She couldn't let this danger hang over her daughter's future. Later that afternoon, Eduardo arrived with a map of the industrial area. The group gathered in Rosa's sewing shop to strategize. Eduardo, practical and confident, traced a path on the map with his finger. "This is the most likely location," he said. "If we approach from the east, we'll have cover from the trees. But we'll need to move quickly. If they see us coming, it's over." Rosa crossed her arms, her sharp gaze fixed on Claire. "You don't have to do this," she said. "We can keep hiding, protect Antonietta here. No one would blame you for wanting to stay safe." Claire shook her head, her voice steady. "This won't end until we find out the truth. I can't live looking over my shoulder every day, wondering if they'll come for her. And Camille deserves justice." That evening, the group prepared to leave. Rosa stayed behind with Antonietta, promising to keep her safe. As Claire kissed her daughter goodbye, the child looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes. "Where are you going, Mommy?" Antonietta asked softly. Claire smiled, though her heart ached. "I'm going to make sure no one can ever hurt us again." The journey to the industrial area was tense. The streets grew quieter and more desolate as they left the familiar warmth of the neighborhood behind. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking structure of rusted metal and shattered windows. As they approached, Alexander and Eduardo signaled for the group to stop. They crouched behind a cluster of overgrown bushes, surveying the area. "There's movement inside," Eduardo whispered. "At least 2 men. Could be more." Claire's pulse quickened. "Do you think it's them?" Alexander nodded grimly. "It's them." The group waited for the right moment, the air thick with anticipation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the area in shadows, they made their move. Eduardo and 2 others flanked the warehouse from the sides, while Alexander and Claire approached from the front. Claire's hands trembled as she held a flashlight, her heart hammering in her chest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint stench of oil. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creak of their footsteps on the metal floor. Suddenly, a voice rang out, sharp and menacing. "Well, well. Look who decided to join us," Ernest said, stepping into the light. Michel stood behind him, his arms crossed and a smirk on his face. Claire's breath caught. This was it, the moment she had been running from for years. "Where's Camille?" Alexander demanded, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. Ernest laughed, cold and mocking. "Camille? She thought she could outsmart us. But she learned the hard way, no one escapes us." Claire's heart sank, fear mingling with rage. "What did you do to her?" she shouted, her voice breaking. Ernest's smile widened. "Why don't we talk about what she did? Or better yet, what you've been hiding? That little girl of yours, she's more valuable than you know." Before anyone could react, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. More men appeared, their presence tightening the noose around Claire and Alexander. The trap had been sprung. And now, the only way out was to face the wolves head-on. The room fell into an eerie stillness, broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Claire's heart raced as she and Alexander stood surrounded by Ernest, Michel, and their accomplices. The warehouse, once a hollow, lifeless space, now felt suffocating, its shadows thick with menace. Ernest took a step forward, his boots scraping against the concrete floor. His smile was serpentine, his voice dripping with mockery. "You thought you could just walk in here and demand answers," he said. "Do you even know what you're meddling with?" Alexander squared his shoulders, his jaw tight with fury. "I know you were involved in Camille's disappearance," he said, his voice steady. "And I know you've been hunting Antonietta. Why? What could you possibly want from a child?" Ernest chuckled, exchanging a glance with Michel, who remained silent but watchful. "Camille underestimated us, just like you're doing now," Ernest said. "She thought she could run, that she could hide something as precious as her daughter. But people like us, we don't just forget." Claire stepped forward, her fear overtaken by a surge of desperation. "Camille trusted me to protect Antonietta," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "She gave up everything to keep her safe. Why? What does Antonietta have to do with any of this?" Ernest's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "It's not about the girl herself," he said, his tone sharp as a blade. "It's about leverage. Camille had something we wanted, something she stole. She thought handing over her daughter would buy her freedom. But she didn't hold up her end of the deal." Claire felt as if the floor had fallen out from under her. "She would never trade her daughter," Claire said firmly. "You're lying." Ernest sneered. "Believe what you want. But Camille's disappearance? That's on her. She made the wrong choices, and now her little secret is back to haunt you." Alexander clenched his fists, his anger barely contained. "Enough of your games," he snapped. "What did Camille steal from you? Where is she?" Ernest raised an eyebrow, amused by Alexander's fury. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?" he said. "Camille was clever, too clever. She vanished before we could finish our business. But she left us a trail, and it led straight to you." He pointed at Claire. Michel finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "The girl is the key," he said simply. "And you've been keeping her from us." Claire's blood turned to ice. They didn't just want Antonietta for leverage, they believed she held the answer to whatever Camille had stolen. "She's just a child," Claire said, her voice rising. "She doesn't know anything." "That's where you're wrong," Ernest replied. "Camille left us breadcrumbs. Hidden messages, clues, all pointing to her precious daughter. That girl knows more than you think, even if she doesn't realize it." Before Claire could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. Eduardo and the others emerged from the shadows, armed with makeshift weapons, pieces of wood, metal pipes, anything they could find. The locals had followed Alexander and Claire into the warehouse, unwilling to let them face the wolves alone. Ernest's smug expression faltered as he assessed the new arrivals. "Ah, the cavalry," he said with mock enthusiasm. "But do you really think a few peasants with sticks are going to stop us?" Eduardo stepped forward, his stance resolute. "We protect our own," he said. "And you're not taking anyone." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire scene were frozen in time. Then, with a sharp motion, Ernest gestured to his men. "Teach them a lesson," he snarled. Chaos erupted. Eduardo and his group clashed with Ernest's men in a whirlwind of shouts and blows. Claire and Alexander ducked behind a stack of crates as the fight unfolded, the metallic clang of weapons and the thud of fists echoing through the warehouse. Alexander grabbed Claire's arm. "We need to find something, anything that proves what they're after," he said. "If we can expose them, we can stop this." Claire nodded, her adrenaline surging. Together, they slipped deeper into the warehouse, navigating through the chaos. As they moved, Claire's eyes caught sight of a small office tucked into the corner of the building. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered inside. "That has to be it," she said, pointing. They darted toward the office, narrowly avoiding a scuffle between Eduardo and one of Ernest's men. Inside, the room was cramped, filled with old filing cabinets and scattered papers. Alexander rifled through the drawers while Claire scanned the desk. Her fingers brushed against a locked metal box. "This," she said, holding it up. "It has to be important." Alexander grabbed a crowbar from the floor and pried the box open. Inside was a stack of documents and a small, battered notebook. Claire flipped through the pages, her breath catching as she recognized Camille's handwriting. "It's her," Claire whispered. "She wrote this." The notebook was filled with codes, maps, and cryptic messages, but one phrase stood out, written in bold letters across the last page: "Trust the key. She carries it." Before they could process the meaning, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Michel, his eyes cold and calculating. "Going through other people's things," he said, stepping into the room. Alexander moved in front of Claire, shielding her. "You've already lost," Alexander said. "We know the truth now." Michel smirked. "Do you?" "Because the only truth that matters is that you're not leaving here alive." The air in the room thickened as Michel advanced. But before he could make his move, a deafening crash echoed through the warehouse. One of the locals had knocked over a massive shelf, sending crates tumbling and forcing Michel to retreat. Alexander grabbed Claire's hand. "Run," he shouted. With the notebook clutched tightly in her hand, Claire ran, her heart pounding as they dodged through the chaos. They had what they needed, but the wolves were still on their heels, and the fight was far from over. The warehouse was in chaos. The sound of shouts, clattering metal, and heavy footsteps reverberated through the cavernous space as Claire and Alexander sprinted toward the exit. The small notebook was clutched tightly in Claire's hands, its cryptic words running through her mind like an unsolvable puzzle: "Trust the key. She carries it." Behind them, Ernest's voice boomed, barking orders to his men. "Don't let them leave. Get that notebook." Claire's lungs burned as she ran, Alexander's hand gripping hers tightly to guide her through the maze of crates and debris. Ahead, Eduardo and his group were holding off Ernest's men, their determination unwavering despite the odds. "We can't keep this up for long," Eduardo shouted as they passed. "Get her out of here." Claire's stomach twisted with guilt at the thought of leaving the others behind, but Alexander pulled her forward. "They'll be fine," he said, his voice firm. "We have to get to Antonietta. She's the key." The words hit Claire like a freight train. Camille's final message in the notebook wasn't just cryptic, it was literal. The realization sent a cold shiver down her spine. "You think she meant Antonietta?" Claire asked breathlessly. Alexander nodded, his face pale but determined. "Camille said Antonietta carried something. What if it's not just symbolic? What if she hid whatever she stole, whatever they're after, on her?" The weight of his words sank in. It made sense. Camille had risked everything to protect Antonietta, even leaving her in Claire's care. If Antonietta held the key to uncovering the truth, then the danger they were in was far worse than Claire had imagined. They burst through the warehouse's side door and into the cold night air. The quiet outside was a stark contrast to the chaos they had just left, but Claire knew it wouldn't last. "Where's Rosa's house?" Alexander asked, scanning the dark streets. Claire pointed toward a cluster of houses in the distance. "This way." They moved quickly, ducking through alleyways and staying in the shadows. The streets were eerily empty, and every sound, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of wind, made Claire jump. Finally, Rosa's house came into view. A single light glowed from the front window, a beacon of safety in the darkness. They hurried to the door, Claire pounding on it urgently. Rosa opened it almost immediately, her face a mix of relief and concern. "Thank God," she said, pulling them inside. What happened? Did you find anything? Claire held up the notebook. We found this. It's Camille's. But there's more, it's Antonietta. They're after her because she has something. We think Camille hid whatever they're looking for on her. Rosa's eyes widened, but she nodded, already moving to the back room where Antonietta was sleeping. Claire and Alexander followed, their hearts pounding. Antonietta was curled up on a small cot, her chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Claire knelt beside her, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sweetheart," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "Wake up. I need to ask you something." Antonietta stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at Claire with a sleepy smile. "Mommy?" Claire's heart ached, but she pushed her emotions aside. "Do you remember the locket your real mommy gave you?" she asked softly. Antonietta nodded, reaching for the chain around her neck. She held up the small, worn locket that she never took off. Claire took it in her hands, examining it closely for the first time. The locket was simple, with a tiny clasp at the side. Inside was the familiar picture of Camille, but as Claire ran her fingers over the edges, she felt something unusual. "Wait," she murmured. She twisted the locket, and with a soft click, a hidden compartment popped open. Inside was a tiny flash drive, no bigger than a fingernail. Claire's breath caught. "This is it," Alexander said, leaning in to see. "This is what they're after." Claire's mind raced. What could be so important that Camille had gone to such lengths to hide it? And what was on the drive that made Ernest and Michel so desperate? Rosa, who had been watching silently, spoke up. "We need to see what's on it. I have an old computer in the sewing room." They moved quickly, their urgency mounting. Rosa booted up the aging computer, its whirring fan sounding far too loud in the tense silence. Alexander inserted the flash drive, and a single folder appeared on the screen. Inside were several documents and videos, all labeled with cryptic titles. He opened the first video. The grainy footage showed a dimly lit room, where Camille was seated at a table, speaking directly into the camera. "If you're watching this," Camille's voice said, trembling but resolute, "it means I couldn't stop them. But you can. This is everything, the proof of what Ernest and Michel have done. The trafficking, the extortion, the murders. They think they're untouchable, but if this gets out, it will destroy them." The room fell silent as the video ended. The weight of Camille's words was staggering. "This is it," Claire said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is why they're after Antonietta. Camille used her to keep this safe." Alexander clenched his fists. "We need to get this to the authorities. If we can expose them, we can end this." But before they could make another move, a loud crash shattered the silence. The front door had been kicked open, and heavy footsteps echoed through the house. "They're here," Rosa whispered, her face pale. Claire grabbed Antonietta, holding her close as Alexander stepped in front of them. Ernest's voice rang out from the hallway, cold and menacing. "You've played a good game," he called, "but it's over now. Hand over the girl and the drive, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here alive." Claire's grip on Antonietta tightened as she whispered to Rosa. "Is there another way out?" Rosa nodded toward the back door, but her expression was grim. "It'll be risky." Alexander's eyes met Claire's. "Take her and go," he said. "I'll hold them off." "No," Claire said firmly. "We do this together." The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Ernest's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Time's up, Claire. Make your choice." The wolves were closing in, but Claire knew one thing for certain: she would fight with everything she had to protect her daughter and the truth Camille had sacrificed so much to hide. The house felt like a fragile shell, barely holding together under the weight of the danger creeping closer. Ernest's cold, calculated voice echoed through the hallway, his words a chilling reminder of the stakes. "Last chance, Claire," he called out. Hand over the girl and the drive, or we'll take them both. And trust me, you don't want that. Claire's heart pounded as she clutched Antonietta tightly, shielding the child behind her. Rosa crouched near the back door, her hands trembling as she held a set of keys to the small gate that led out of the house. Alexander stood by the main doorway, his shoulders squared and his jaw clenched. The notebook and flash drive were tucked safely in his pocket, the evidence that could expose the wolves hanging by a thread. "Claire," Alexander said in a low voice, turning to meet her gaze. "You and Antonietta need to go now. Rosa will get you to safety. I'll keep them here." "No," Claire whispered, shaking her head. "I won't leave you to face them alone." Alexander took a step closer, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "Listen to me. The most important thing right now is keeping Antonietta safe. Camille gave everything to protect her. We can't let that be for nothing." Tears filled Claire's eyes as she realized the truth of his words. She looked down at Antonietta, who was holding the locket tightly in her small hands, her face pale but brave. "I'll come back for you," Claire said, her voice trembling. Alexander gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You will. But first, go." Reluctantly, Claire nodded. Rosa opened the back door as quietly as she could, the hinges creaking faintly. She led Claire and Antonietta out into the narrow alley behind the house, the cold night air biting against their skin. Inside the house, Alexander faced the front door as Ernest and Michel stepped into the room, flanked by two other men. Ernest's sharp features were illuminated by the dim light, his eyes gleaming with malice. Well, Ernest said, his lips curling into a smirk. "The groom himself. I have to say, Alexander, I'm impressed. You've gone to quite the lengths for a woman who betrayed you." Alexander's fists tightened at his sides. "Claire didn't betray anyone. She did what Camille asked her to do, what she had to do to protect Antonietta." "Ah, yes," Michel interjected, his gravelly voice dripping with sarcasm. "The noble savior routine. Spare us the speech. Hand over the drive, and we might let you leave in one piece." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "You're not getting anything." Ernest sighed, feigning disappointment. "Pity. I was hoping we could handle this civilly. But I guess some lessons have to be taught the hard way." He nodded to the men flanking him, who began advancing toward Alexander. Claire and Rosa moved quickly through the narrow alleyway, their breaths visible in the cold night air. Antonietta clung to Claire's hand, her small legs struggling to keep up. "Where are we going?" Antonietta asked, her voice trembling. "To a safe place," Claire said, though her own fear was barely concealed. "I promise, sweetheart, I'll keep you safe." The alley opened into a larger street lined with darkened houses and flickering streetlights. Rosa stopped, pointing toward a nearby building with a boarded-up window. "There's a shelter there," she said. "The caretaker knows me. You'll be safe for now." Claire hesitated, torn between staying with Alexander and ensuring Antonietta's safety. Rosa gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "He'll be fine," Rosa said. "Trust him." Reluctantly, Claire nodded, following Rosa toward the shelter. The sound of a chair smashing against the wall echoed through the house as Alexander struggled against Ernest's men. Despite being outnumbered, his determination gave him an edge. He ducked a punch, countering with a sharp elbow to one man's ribs, sending him crashing to the floor. But Michel was faster. He grabbed Alexander by the collar and shoved him against the wall, his grin cruel. "You've got guts," Michel said. "Too bad it won't save you." Before Michel could land a blow, a loud shout from Eduardo came from the front doorway. The carpenter, armed with a heavy metal pipe, swung it with precision, striking Michel's arm and forcing him to release Alexander. Eduardo's arrival shifted the tide of the fight. The locals, unwilling to let their community fall victim to violence, surged into the house. Armed with anything they could find, wooden planks, tools, even kitchen utensils, they fought with the ferocity of people defending their own. Ernest and Michel were caught off guard by the resistance. Ernest's smirk vanished as he realized his men were quickly outmatched. "This isn't over," he snarled, grabbing Michel by the arm and retreating toward the door. Alexander, panting and bruised but unbroken, stood tall as the men fled into the night. Eduardo clapped him on the shoulder, his expression proud. "You held your ground," Eduardo said. "You've got more fight in you than I thought." Alexander managed a weak smile. "Thanks. But it's not over yet. We need to get to Claire and Antonietta." Claire paced nervously in the small, dimly lit room where she and Antonietta had taken refuge. Rosa stood by the door, keeping watch. Every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind made Claire's heart race. Finally, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway. Claire spun around, relief flooding her as Alexander appeared in the doorway. His face was bruised, and his clothes were torn, but he was alive. "You're here," Claire whispered, running to him. Alexander pulled her into a tight embrace, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "They're gone," he said. "For now. But we have what we need to stop them." He reached into his pocket and handed her the flash drive and notebook. "This is our proof. We take this to the authorities, and Ernest and Michel won't be able to hurt anyone ever again." Claire looked at him, hope mingling with fear. "Do you really think it's over?" Alexander shook his head. "No. But it's a start." As the first rays of dawn broke through the boarded-up window, the small group knew their fight was far from over. But for the first time, they had the upper hand, and a glimmer of hope for the justice Camille had fought so hard to achieve. The morning brought little relief. The golden light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the shelter's boarded-up windows, but the sense of danger lingered like a shadow over Claire and her small group. Rosa brewed a pot of coffee in the corner, her movements deliberate and quiet as if she didn't want to disturb the fragile silence. Antonietta sat at a makeshift table, drawing with the colored pencils that Rosa had given her. Claire watched her daughter's small hands move across the page, the innocence of her actions in stark contrast to the storm raging outside their fragile sanctuary. Alexander was seated nearby, nursing a bruised shoulder. Eduardo leaned against the doorframe, a rifle slung over his shoulder, a relic he had brought from his father's days as a farmer, one he hoped he wouldn't have to use. "We need to act now," Alexander said, breaking the silence. His voice was firm but low, laced with exhaustion. "We have the evidence. The longer we wait, the more chances they have to regroup." Claire nodded, gripping the flash drive in her hands as if it were a lifeline. The notebook sat on the table beside her, its pages a reminder of Camille's sacrifice. "But how do we get this to the authorities?" Claire asked. "Ernest and Michel could be watching the roads. If we're caught..." Rosa turned from the stove, her expression resolute. "There's a journalist I know," she said. "Her name is Julieta Mendez. She's fearless and has been investigating corruption for years. If anyone can make sure this gets into the right hands, it's her." Alexander frowned. "A journalist? That could make us targets even faster. Ernest won't let this go quietly." Rosa shook her head. "Julieta's protected. She has connections, powerful ones. If she takes this story, it'll spread so fast Ernest and Michel won't have time to silence it." Claire exchanged a look with Alexander. They both knew it was a risk, but every other path seemed even more dangerous. "How do we contact her?" Claire asked. "She works out of a cafe downtown," Rosa said. "It's her meeting place for informants. I can take you there." An hour later, the group was ready. Rosa stayed behind to watch over Antonietta, who had fallen asleep clutching her locket. Claire kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering promises to return soon. Her heart ached as she walked out the door, leaving Antonietta behind, but she knew this was the only way to secure their future. Alexander, Eduardo, and Claire climbed into an old pickup truck that Eduardo had borrowed from a neighbor. The truck's engine sputtered to life, its rattling noise almost too loud in the quiet streets. The drive to the cafe was tense, every corner turned with caution, every passing car scrutinized for threats. "Do you think they'll follow us?" Claire asked, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror. "They're not stupid," Eduardo said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "If they suspect we have the evidence, they'll do everything they can to stop us." Alexander rested a reassuring hand on Claire's arm. "We'll get there," he said. "We have to." As they neared the cafe, a small, bustling corner establishment surrounded by colorful murals, Claire's stomach tightened. It was a public place, which offered some safety, but also made it easy for anyone to spot them. "Stay alert," Eduardo said as he parked the truck a block away. The cafe was alive with chatter and the clinking of coffee cups. Julieta Mendez sat at a table near the back, her sharp features softened by a scarf draped around her neck. Her presence exuded quiet authority, her eyes scanning the room with the precision of someone used to looking for trouble. Claire and Alexander approached her cautiously, their movements deliberate. Julieta looked up as they neared, her expression curious but guarded. "Rosa sent us," Claire said softly, sliding into the seat across from her. Julieta leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto Claire's. "If Rosa sent you, it means you have something important," Julieta said. "Something dangerous." Alexander pulled out the flash drive and placed it on the table. "This," he said. "It's everything. Proof of what Ernest and Michelle have done, trafficking, corruption, and Camille's disappearance. It's enough to bring them down." Julieta picked up the flash drive, examining it before tucking it into her bag. "I'll need to verify it," she said. "But if this is as explosive as you say, it'll be on every news station by morning." Claire's voice broke slightly as she spoke. "Please, they're after my daughter. Camille gave her life to protect her. If this doesn't work, they'll never stop hunting us." Julieta's expression softened, and she nodded. "I promise you, I'll make this public. And once it's out there, they won't have anywhere to hide." But before they could leave, the sound of tires screeching outside froze them in place. Julieta's sharp gaze darted to the window. "They're here," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "Go out the back." The group bolted through the cafe's kitchen, Julieta leading them to a rear exit. Outside, the alley was a narrow labyrinth of dumpsters and fire escapes. Eduardo stayed close, scanning for any sign of pursuit. Behind them, the unmistakable sound of shouting and pounding footsteps grew louder. Ernest and Michelle's men were closing in. "Keep moving," Alexander urged, grabbing Claire's hand as they wove through the maze of alleys. A black car screeched to a halt at the end of the alley, blocking their path. Two men jumped out, guns drawn. Eduardo cursed under his breath. "This way," he said, pulling the group into a side alley. Claire's heart hammered as they ran, her legs burning with exertion. The shouts of their pursuers echoed closer, but the maze of alleys offered them precious seconds. Finally, they burst out onto a crowded street, blending into the flow of people. The chaos of the city worked in their favor, and within minutes, they managed to lose their pursuers. Hours later, they returned to the shelter, exhausted but alive. Julieta had escaped separately, promising to contact them once the story was published. Rosa greeted them at the door, relief etched on her face. Antonietta ran to Claire, throwing her arms around her mother's waist. "Mommy, you're back," she said, her voice filled with joy. Claire knelt down, holding her daughter close. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." As the group settled in for the night, a quiet sense of hope began to take root. The evidence was out of their hands, on its way to becoming a weapon that could destroy Ernest and Michelle's empire. But the fight wasn't over yet. Somewhere in the city, the wolves were regrouping, their anger turning into desperation. And Claire knew that when cornered, wolves were at their most dangerous. The night was unsettlingly quiet at the shelter. The only sounds were the faint creaks of the old wooden floors and the distant hum of passing cars. Claire sat by the window in the small room she shared with Antonietta, her eyes scanning the dark street below. Every flicker of movement sent her heart racing. Julieta had promised to contact them once the evidence was securely in the hands of trusted allies, but the waiting was agonizing. They had taken a monumental step, but Claire knew the wolves wouldn't retreat easily. Antonietta was asleep on a small cot, clutching her locket. Rosa had placed a chair by the door, a silent guardian determined to protect them no matter what. Eduardo, stationed near the back entrance, kept his rifle close, his expression grim and watchful. Alexander entered the room quietly, his presence steady and reassuring. He handed Claire a cup of tea, the steam curling into the cool air. "You should try to rest," he said gently. Claire shook her head, her hands trembling slightly as she held the cup. "How can I rest when they're still out there?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander pulled a chair closer to hers, his eyes meeting hers with a calm intensity. "They're desperate now," he said. "They know they've lost control. That makes them dangerous, but it also makes them reckless. We just have to stay strong a little longer." Claire nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her. "What if Julieta doesn't make it?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "What if they stop her before she can expose them?" Alexander placed a hand on her arm, steadying her. "She'll make it," he said firmly. "Julieta is smart. She knows how to stay ahead of them." But just as his words settled into the air, a sharp noise broke the stillness, a car door slamming shut, loud and deliberate. Claire froze, her blood running cold. Alexander's eyes darted to the window, his body tensing as he moved to look outside. "What is it?" Claire whispered. Alexander's face darkened. "They're here," he said. The shelter erupted into motion. Rosa hurried to secure the front door, her movements swift and precise despite her age. Eduardo slipped into the shadows near the back entrance, his rifle at the ready. Claire grabbed Antonietta, who stirred groggily, her sleepy voice murmuring, "Mommy." "It's okay, sweetheart," Claire said, her voice trembling but calm. "We're going to play a quiet game, all right? Stay close to me." Alexander turned to Claire, his expression firm. "Take her to the attic," he said. "There's a hatch near the back hallway. Stay hidden." "What about you?" Claire asked, panic rising in her chest. "I'll be right behind you," he said, his voice steady. But Claire saw the determination in his eyes. He wasn't planning to hide. He was planning to fight. Reluctantly, she nodded and hurried toward the back hallway, Antonietta clinging to her hand. The sound of heavy footsteps and muffled voices grew louder as Ernest's men approached the shelter. A loud bang echoed through the building as the front door shook under the force of a kick. "They're trying to break in," Rosa called out, her voice sharp. Alexander and Eduardo exchanged a look, then positioned themselves near the entrance. Eduardo raised his rifle, his hand steady despite the tension. "We hold them here," Eduardo said. "No matter what." In the attic, the air was stale and thick with dust. Claire crouched low with Antonietta, her arms wrapped protectively around the child. The only light came from a small, grimy window, and the faint sounds of shouting and crashes below sent chills through Claire's body. "Mommy, I'm scared," Antonietta whispered, her voice trembling. Claire kissed the top of her daughter's head, her voice soft but resolute. "I know, sweetheart. But you're so brave. Just stay quiet, okay? I promise we'll be all right." Antonietta nodded, clutching her locket tightly. Claire's eyes lingered on the small pendant, the hidden flash drive within it their lifeline to justice. A sudden crash from below made Claire flinch. The sound of splintering wood and raised voices filled the air. The wolves were inside. The main room of the shelter was chaos. Ernest and Michel led the charge, their men spreading through the house like a pack of predators. Eduardo fired a warning shot, the deafening crack of the rifle echoing through the room. "Stay back," he shouted. Ernest smirked, unfazed. "You think you can stop us with that relic?" he taunted. "We'll take what's ours, one way or another." Alexander moved with precision, using the element of surprise to knock one of Ernest's men unconscious with a well-aimed blow. He turned to face Ernest, his voice filled with controlled fury. "You're finished, Ernest. It's over." Ernest's smirk widened. "Not quite," he said, pulling a gun from his coat. The standoff was brief but electric. Eduardo aimed his rifle at Ernest, but Michel moved faster, striking Eduardo's arm and sending the weapon clattering to the floor. Alexander lunged at Ernest, the two men grappling fiercely. Furniture splintered under their weight as they fought, neither willing to give an inch. Claire heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate. Panic surged through her as she realized Ernest's men were searching the house. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Antonietta looked up at her, her eyes wide but trusting. "What do we do, Mommy?" Claire's mind raced. The attic had no escape route, no way out if they were found. Desperation fueled her actions as she grabbed a heavy wooden beam from the corner of the attic and positioned herself near the hatch. The hatch creaked as it opened, a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. A man climbed up, his figure silhouetted against the light. Claire didn't hesitate. With a surge of adrenaline, she swung the beam with all her strength, striking him across the shoulder. He fell back with a grunt, tumbling down the ladder. "Stay behind me," Claire said to Antonietta, her voice trembling but determined. Below, the chaos reached its peak. Alexander, battered but relentless, managed to wrestle Ernest to the ground. Eduardo, despite his injury, retrieved his rifle and held Michel at bay. The sudden wail of approaching sirens cut through the noise, freezing everyone in place. "Police," a voice boomed from outside. "Drop your weapons and come out with your hands up." Ernest's face twisted in fury as he realized his time was up. He shoved Alexander away, darting toward the back door, but Eduardo blocked his path. The wolves were finally cornered. As the police stormed the building, Claire and Antonietta emerged from the attic, their faces pale but resolute. Alexander, bruised and bleeding, smiled weakly as he saw them. "It's over," he said, his voice filled with relief. Claire hugged Antonietta tightly, tears streaming down her face. The wolves had been caught, but the fight for justice wasn't over yet. The flash drive and notebook were now in the hands of Julieta and the authorities. The truth about Ernest and Michel's crimes would finally come to light. But as Claire looked at her daughter, she knew one thing for certain: no matter what came next, she would protect Antonietta with every ounce of strength she had left. The shelter was quieter now, though the air remained heavy with the aftermath of the chaos. The police had taken Ernest, Michel, and their men into custody. The flash of red and blue lights outside cast eerie shadows through the windows, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Claire allowed herself a breath of relief. Antonietta clung to her side, her small hands gripping Claire's dress as if afraid she might disappear. Claire crouched down, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "It's over, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're safe now." Antonietta looked up at her, her wide, innocent eyes searching Claire's face. "Mommy, are the bad men gone forever?" Claire hesitated. The desire to shield her daughter from the complexities of the world warred with the need for honesty. She placed her hands on Antonietta's small shoulders. "Yes, my love," she said softly. "The bad men are gone. And they can't hurt us anymore." From the doorway, Alexander watched the tender exchange. His face was bruised, his clothes torn and stained, but his eyes held the quiet resolve of a man who had faced down his worst fears and survived. "We need to talk," he said gently. Claire kissed Antonietta's forehead and stood, guiding her toward Rosa, who was cleaning up the remnants of their barricade. "Stay with Rosa, okay?" "I'll be right here," Claire said. Antonietta nodded and reluctantly let go of Claire's hand. Claire joined Alexander near the window, where the faint hum of police radios and muffled conversations drifted in from outside. Eduardo stood nearby, silently cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical as he kept an eye on the street. "They're taking Ernest and Michelle to the station," Alexander said, his voice low. "But it's not over. They have powerful connections, people who've helped them stay untouchable for years. It won't be easy to bring them down." Claire's chest tightened. "What about the flash drive? The notebook?" Julieta said it was enough. Alexander nodded. "It is. But we're dealing with more than just two men. Their network runs deep: government officials, police, businessmen. Julieta's story will hit them hard, but they'll fight back. We need to be ready for what comes next." The enormity of the situation weighed on Claire. She had spent so long running, focused only on keeping Antonietta safe, that she hadn't allowed herself to think about the larger battle at play. Now, there was no escaping it. "What do we do?" she asked. Alexander reached out, taking her hand. His touch was steady, grounding. "We keep fighting," he said. "For Camille, for Antonietta, for everyone they've hurt. We've already come this far. We can't stop now." Later that evening, the group gathered in the small kitchen of the shelter. The atmosphere was heavy but no longer oppressive. There was a sense of quiet determination, a shared understanding that they had crossed a threshold. Julieta called, her voice brisk but tinged with excitement. "The story's out," she said. "Every major news outlet is running it. Names, documents, video footage, it's all there. Ernest and Michelle's empire is crumbling." Claire leaned against the counter, relief washing over her. "Will it be enough?" Julieta hesitated before answering. "It's a start. Their connections will try to cover for them, but public pressure is a powerful thing. The more people know the truth, the harder it'll be for anyone to protect them." After hanging up, Claire relayed the news to the others. For the first time, Rosa smiled, a small but genuine expression of hope. Eduardo nodded, his usual stoicism giving way to a sense of pride. "They thought they were untouchable," Eduardo said. "Now the whole world knows what they've done." As the others celebrated quietly, Claire slipped outside, drawn by the cool night air and the need to clear her mind. She stood on the small porch, gazing up at the stars that dotted the dark sky. Alexander joined her a few moments later, leaning against the railing. "You okay?" he asked. Claire nodded, though her expression was distant. I keep thinking about Camille," she said. "She fought so hard, gave up so much. And even now, she's still not here to see this." Alexander's gaze softened. "She's with us," he said. "Everything we've done, everything we're fighting for, it's because of her. And because of you." Claire turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was so scared, Alexander. Scared that I wouldn't be strong enough. That I'd lose Antonietta, or you, or myself in all of this." "You didn't," Alexander said firmly. "You've been stronger than you think. And you're not alone anymore." The weight of his words settled into her heart, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean into the quiet comfort he offered. Inside the shelter, Antonietta's soft laughter drifted through the air as Rosa told her a story about a brave little girl who outsmarted a wolf. Eduardo cleaned the last of his tools, setting them aside with care. The night felt calm, but Claire knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The wolves had been wounded, but their reach was long, and their desperation would make them even more dangerous. But as she stood there, hand in hand with Alexander, watching her daughter smile despite everything, Claire felt a flicker of hope. They had exposed the truth, and while the battle ahead would be difficult, they were no longer fighting it alone. For Camille. For Antonietta. For the life they deserved. The morning after the story broke, the shelter was alive with quiet but palpable hope. The headlines were everywhere: criminal empire exposed, Ernest and Michelle's network unveiled. Video footage of Camille, the files from the flash drive, and Julietta's relentless reporting had created a storm no one could ignore. News anchors discussed the magnitude of the crimes, the victims who had suffered in silence, and the bravery of those who brought the truth to light. Claire stood in the small living room, holding Antonietta close as the TV broadcast a breaking news report. The screen showed Ernest and Michelle being escorted into custody, their faces grim as cameras flashed around them. "Mommy," Antonietta asked softly, "are the bad men gone forever now?" Claire knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes, brushing a hand over her cheek. "They're going away for a long time," Claire said gently. "And they can't hurt anyone anymore." Later that day, Julietta arrived at the shelter. Her energy was electric, her satisfaction evident as she set her bag on the table and pulled out a stack of papers. "You did it," she said, addressing Claire, Alexander, and Eduardo. "Everything is out there. And because of that, the authorities are finally taking this seriously. Investigations are expanding, more arrests are coming." Claire's heart swelled with a mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Julietta," she said. "For believing us. For making sure Camille's voice was heard." Julietta smiled, though her expression softened with a hint of sadness. "Camille deserved justice," she said. "And now, because of her, so many others will finally have it." As they went over the next steps, Rosa entered with a tray of coffee and tea. Her steady presence reminded everyone that, despite the chaos of the past days, they were still standing. Eduardo leaned against the doorway, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "So, what happens now?" he asked. Julietta folded her hands on the table. "There will be hearings, trials, it'll take time. But for now, you've done your part. The evidence is in the right hands." Alexander looked at Claire. "And for us?" he asked. Claire hesitated, the weight of the question settling over her. For so long, her focus had been on surviving, on protecting Antonietta. Now, the thought of rebuilding their lives felt both exhilarating and overwhelming. "I don't know," Claire admitted. "But maybe we can finally stop running." A week later, Claire found herself standing in the same church where her life had unraveled. The once stifling memories of that day were replaced by a quiet sense of closure. The church was empty except for Alexander, who stood beside her, and Antonietta, who wandered down the aisle, her laughter echoing softly in the space. "You didn't have to come back here," Alexander said, his voice low and gentle. Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with both pain and determination. "I did," she said. "This is where it all began. And now, it's where I want to let it go." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey pressing against them. Then, Alexander reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "We've been through so much," he said. "But we're still here. Together." Claire turned to him, a small smile breaking through her somber expression. "And we have Antonietta," she said. "She's our future." As they watched Antonietta twirl in her little dress, her carefree movements a symbol of everything they had fought for, Claire felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Back at Rosa's home, the neighborhood had come together to celebrate. The community that had embraced Claire and Antonietta now gathered to mark the end of a chapter and the beginning of something new. Children played in the courtyard, their laughter blending with the sound of music drifting from a small radio. Rosa approached Claire with a plate of food, her kind eyes sparkling. "You found your strength, Querida," she said. "Now it's time to live." Claire nodded, her gaze drifting to Alexander, who was helping Eduardo fix a broken bench. Antonietta sat nearby, drawing pictures of flowers and stars with the other children. For the first time, the future felt like something they could shape, rather than something they had to fear. That evening, as the celebration wound down, Claire sat with Antonietta under the stars. The little girl rested her head on her mother's lap, her voice soft and curious. "Mommy, do you think Camille can see us from heaven?" Claire's throat tightened, but she managed a smile. "I think so," she said. "And I think she's proud of how brave you've been." Antonietta held up her locket, the small pendant glinting in the moonlight. "She gave me this so I wouldn't forget her," Antonietta said. "And you never will," Claire whispered. "Because she'll always be with us." As Alexander joined them, sitting close and wrapping an arm around Claire's shoulders, the three of them looked up at the vast night sky. Their journey had been filled with pain and loss, but also with resilience and love. And now, together, they faced a new horizon, one filled with hope, justice, and the promise of a life no longer defined by fear. For Camille. For Antonietta. For each other.